Assalamualaikum, good morning. It's really good to see everyone today. Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panel speakers whom I had the pleasure to spend time with this morning. And today are Ms. Fairuz Alia Jamaluddin, Head of Education UNHCR, Deborah Henry, Co-founder of Refugee School, Ms. Felicia Yun, Co-founder of Arus Academy, and also our moderator, Ms. Davina N. Raja. Thank you all for being here. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's ILMU session, Learning Against the Odds, Education, Access for Refugee and Undocumented Children in Malaysia. Such a very important topic that I hope can grow arms and legs so that we can bring change and the impact that we want to see in our country. So education is the great equalizer. I think many of us here in the room have benefited from access to quality education and have had our life changed by it. It is a fundamental right and one of the most powerful tools to break cycles of poverty. And it also fosters opportunity and build inclusive societies. Yet here in Malaysia, many refugees and undocumented children continue to face significant barriers. And some of these will be unpacked by our esteemed speakers later. And limited access to formal schooling, financial constraints, and language challenges and uncertain legal status often deny them the chance to learn in a safe and nurturing environment. How many of us here in this room know of an undocumented children or a child that is denied education because of their status? You can show roughly, put out your hands. How many that you've met personally in person and you know their names, their faces, their dreams, vision? Okay. So that's at least half the room. Which means that the number is quite significant. And so here we are together, aiming that the session can do three things. First of all, raise awareness of the lived realities of children who are often invisible in policy discussions, yet profoundly impacted by them. So the people not in the room, so the people whom you've met personally, you know their dreams and desires, how heartbreaking it is. I once spent in 2016 a day with kids, refugee kids at the school in Sentul, and I ran art classes with them. And I said they were painting, there were boys standing outside the classes that were meant to be for 10-year-olds and below. And these are like 15 and 16-year-old boys looking with wide eyes. It's like, why are you standing there? Oh, I want to join you paint. So as we invited them in and they painted, and then we asked them, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they got so excited, despite the fact they're 15, 16, when someone asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? I didn't realize that is a question, very fundamental question that never got asked to them. So some of them, despite never having gone to school, say that, I want to be a doctor. Why? Because I want to heal all the sick kids and mothers and fathers who are crying in pain back from where I came from in Myanmar. Another child said that I want to be an architect. Why do you want to be an architect? Because I want to rebuild my country. Another child said that I want to be an engineer. Why do you want to be an engineer? Because I want to bring all the innovation back to my country. That moment made me realize how those questions that we ask our kids so casually at home, what do you want to be when you grow up, is actually a luxury for some, which is unfair because every child deserves to dream what they want to be when they grow up. So I hope that today, in addition to for you to be able to understand the lived realities that they face, if you don't put our compassionate heart and our empathy and our ability to do things to them, I hope that we can also together recognize that education is also not just about the grades and the academics, but it's also about cultivating understanding and reducing prejudice. Because many of us, not in this room, I'm very confident of that, but many of us out there feel that because they're not one of us. So for example, they're not people of this land, or they're, all sorts of things that are called under the bucket of prejudice. I hope we can together pinpoint exactly when a moment of prejudice happened and call that out and tell people off. Start telling you that's prejudice, so that, because that is using your voice to overcome the situation, and also together combine our minds and explore solutions, from policy shifts to innovative programs, and also partnerships together. I think what's magical potentially from each of you in this room is that those partnerships happen organically. That you probably walk up to Deborah, walk up to Alia, or anyone else, like even Dr. Billy, for example, like, hey, like, can you do something about this? Like, even if it's small, even if it's about planting vegetables together, or making sure that they have healthy meals, or even just spending time to cultivate that dream, so that even if those dreams doesn't become reality today, it would have planted a seed, a healthy seed within them, that it's okay to dream. It's human. It's a human luxury to dream. So why is this important? Because of the future of our nation depends not only on the children within its classrooms, but also, and often more importantly, the ones you leave outside. So refugees and undocumented children are not passive recipients of aid. They are resilient, resourceful, and full of potential human beings. And it is actually our loss not to tap onto those potential. We are the one at the losing end. Imagine these are your future doctors, architects, engineers that could be of world standard, breaking records because of their ingenuity and resilience. We are losing out on their talent. So by ensuring access to quality education, we not only safeguard their future, but also enrich our society with talents, perspective, and who knows, maybe become our savior someday when we are in crisis. We are honored today to have with us a lineup of distinguished panel speakers again, and we both live experiences and expertise to the discussion. Fairuz Alia, Deborah, Felicia, Davina, once again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, and also to congratulate our education team led by Dr. Anwar, my dear friend there, who's really tireless at building access to quality education. He looks very young, but he's actually been working on this for decades. So he's a bit of a vampire there, but do walk up to him, because he's the great guy making this happen with his team, wonderful team in this room. Find them around the room, because they're all very passionate about this issue. And also the MLE team led by Aditi, the lovely lady at the end there, who's pretending to be very quiet, but she's very incredibly smart. I'm like in love with her brain. So talk to her, because she and her team also put together the impact assessment bids for this, and yeah, they've curated something that is so timely and meaningful, and what a way to spend our beautiful morning and reflecting on Hasanah's mission to advance equity, dignity, and opportunity for all, especially the most marginalized, in terms of advancing Malaysia 1% at a time across all layers of society. So at Hasanah, on behalf of Hasanah, we hope that today's dialogue will not only deepen our understanding, but also inspire practical action to make education in Malaysia more inclusive, empathetic, transformative, and most importantly, human. So when one child is denied the chance to learn, we lose. But when every child is given the opportunity to learn, we all gain collectively, with the synergy. So as we embark on this discussion, my hope is that we will not only deepen our awareness of the barriers refugees and undocumented children face, but also recognize education as one of the most powerful tools for empathy, social cohesion, and nation building. More importantly, I hope that today's session will spark practical ideas, whether through programs, policies, or partnerships that can truly make a difference in ensuring that no child is left behind, is beyond rhetoric, beyond talk, but more action. Thank you very much for being here. Your presence matter, you matter, and I look forward to the insights and reflections that will emerge today. Okay, let the conversations begin. Thank you. In the panel's discussion, after which we will have Q&A session. To our virtual and in-person audience, feel free to scan the QR code up front to ask any question that you may have. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our moderator for today, Davina and Raja, Program Associate from Architect of Diversity Malaysia. Together with our panelists, Fairuz Alia Jamaluddin, Head of Education, UNHCR Malaysia. Deborah Henry, Co-founder, Refugee School. And Felicia Yoon, Co-founder, Arus Academy, to continue with the panel discussion.
Right. Thank you very much, Tasha, for the introduction. On behalf of Yayasan Hasanah, thank you for joining us today for ILMU Hasanah 2025. This is a flagship space where it is primarily for knowledge sharing, and it is a powerful space indeed. I am so grateful and so privileged to be given the opportunity to moderate such a distinguished panel. So my name is Davina. I work with AOD, and we do a lot of work on social cohesion and tackling discrimination, which is really just a fancy term for saying that we spend a lot of time trying to help Malaysians understand and embrace their differences and find ways of working together instead of letting those differences divide us. And so I'm quite biased. I come from an education background, so I believe that nothing builds bridges faster than education. And with that, I think this topic, the topic that we have today, learning against the odds, education access for refugee and undocumented children in Malaysia, is a very important one. Before we proceed, I'd like to very quickly introduce our panel today. We have Fairuz Alia, and she works as the Head of Education for UNHCR Malaysia. We have Deborah Henry, and she is the co-founder of Refugee School. We also have Felicia Yoon, and she is also the co-founder of Arus Academy. And so before we move on, I'd like the panelists to get an opportunity to introduce themselves. So Alia, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Davina. So, as you know, my full name is actually Fairuz Alia Jamaluddin, but you can call me Alia. I'm currently the education lead for UNHCR. And so, as you know, UNHCR is the UN Refugee Agency. What we do is basically, our main mandate is actually to protect and safeguard refugees who are in Malaysia. And specifically for UNHCR Malaysia, is focusing on those refugees who are in Malaysia. So besides, as you may know, registering refugees and issuing UNHCR cards, we also have programs, and one of it is actually education. So I'm the lead for education, and I guess that's all for now. Happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Right, thanks Alia. Deborah, over to you.
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting us to speak here today. I think I could safely say maybe five or slightly more than 5 years ago, we wouldn't be sitting in this room with Yayasan Hasanah talking about refugees and undocumented people. So I think this is testament to the fact that, as Pon said earlier, every individual has a role to play, every individual has the power, as a Malaysian, as a non-Malaysian living here, to be a voice to advocate for marginalized, because you do see that there will be an impact, you see change happening, right? So to just recognize that. So I guess my story, my personal story, first meeting refugees and then starting a non-profit takes me back to 2008. And I'm somewhat connected to UNHCR because I reached out to them for some articles on refugees in Malaysia, and then they reached out to me a little while later and invited me to host a documentary on refugees living in Malaysia. And so I visited a family of 4 Somali siblings in Gombak, 20 minutes from our Twin Towers, and that moment really stayed with me. How can, as a Malaysian, and looking at other children in my country, and to think what future will these children have if they're not in school? And so Refugee started on a very simple premise that all children, no matter who they are, where they come from, have the right to access education, quality education in some form. And so maybe just to highlight a little bit about the organization, we started off in 2009, so tuition in 2008, and we met the community. They said there was a need, and so we informally started Refugee School in 2009 with the community. So we were really serving a need at that point in time. And I distinctly remember my mindset then, right? It was providing refugees with a basic education. So not quality, a basic education. And why basic? Because we're like, okay, they're here in Malaysia for a few years, we don't know how long, life is hard as it is, so we'll give them something, some math, some English, at least they're sitting in a school, and then hopefully they get resettled quickly and they can continue to build a good life, right? But that's not gonna happen here, because everything is against us. We're swimming upstream. And then we started with 60 kids, primary education, but then we saw the need was greater. It went down, so then we expanded downwards to kindergarten and then upwards to secondary school. And fast forward a few years, if you ask me in the past, say 5-6 years, where we stand as an organization, we've shifted from just surviving, basic education, survival, to how do we ensure refugees can thrive in unreasonable circumstances? So this big mindset shift that we've had, and I think the whole sector has had, recognizing that these people, these humans that we call refugees, can be any of us in this room, are here in our country, and they're not here for 1 or 2 years. Many are here for generations, for decades. And so this basic education, this temporary life in limbo, it's just not good enough, right? We're not preparing them for anything, for a successful life. And so the idea of, the reality is, life is hard. The situation is untenable, it's unreasonable, but despite all those challenges, we still want to ensure that refugees can thrive. And how do we all work together to achieve that? So now for Refugee as an organization, what we provide is a stacked education program from kindergarten to primary to secondary to tertiary education, eventually to livelihoods, to jobs. The whole education journey for a refugee child, just like most of us had, that privilege of education into adulthood, so that they can make a better life for themselves. And that's our mission, to be able to improve refugee life outcomes despite the challenging circumstances. And we recognize that, and I think even the work Aris is doing, it's not just academic, it has to be social and emotional support, and it has to also be life skills. Because we know that for all of us, just being smart or having a good grade just isn't good enough. We need the resilience, the grit, to be able to deal with life. Once you walk out of a school, there's so much going on, challenges. And so that's our commitment today as an organization, to be able to work with partners, to be able to work with individuals, all stakeholders, to push that needle, even if it's like an inch every year. We don't lose hope, we keep at it, but recognizing that, as Pon said earlier, we're all in this together, collective responsibility, collective humanity, and we can see that when one community is suffering, it affects all of us. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Felicia, over to you.
So I think Deborah mentioned a lot of things that we also do. But I think at Aris Academy, we started off very much focused on providing meaningful education, mostly from just for Malaysians to start with, because the 4 co-founders of Aris Academy, we were all teachers under the Teach for Malaysia program. And essentially that was how we saw the need for quality education, and we wanted to really provide that for anyone that we meet. And then over the years, we met on the ground people like Yayasan Chowkit, Buku Jalanan Chowkit, and we saw that there was a need to provide, as Deborah said, quality education to these students as well. Because often we think, okay, basic is enough. We want to ensure that they can read, they can survive a skill. But eventually you realize that is not enough. You want them to be able to thrive, because when I met them, so back in 2000, just before COVID in fact, so we did a program with Buku Jalanan Chowkit. I was teaching them how to code. And we did a TED Talk with them as well. So they prepared a TED Talk that they delivered. And through that I realized that actually they are no different. That any child that I've met, they have dreams just like any child that Puan Siti was mentioning.
And why are they not given the opportunity to receive quality education? And that is basically the beginning of Arus Academy, working together with Buku Jalanan Chowkit, working together now with Yayasan Chowkit as well, to basically provide quality education to these people. Because when I look at these students, they not only have the potential, but they have such a yearn for quality education that I think when you meet these kids, you feel like you can't just step away. You feel like you have to do something because they do deserve quality education. They did not ask to be born in such a situation. And because of that, I think it's important that we look into it as well.
Great, thank you, Felicia. Before we move on further, maybe if in a few words or so, Deborah and Felicia, would you mind talking a wee bit about your projects that you do with Hasanah?
So I think for Arus Academy, we were fortunate enough to get a grant from Yayasan Hasanah to basically support the academy. And I think a very quick story, right, on why this early education is so important. And when I say early, I don't mean like kindergarten kind of education, but getting these students into a space where they are getting quality education. Why is it very important? Because recently, 3 of our students, they were very lucky, they got their IC. So full IC, because before this they had problems with their mother's documents, and once that was sorted, the 3 children were given IC. Now imagine, right, these 3 brothers, next year, one of them would be 12 years old, one would be 15, and one would be 16. If we never had the opportunity to give them that quality education, they would enter into primary school, the 12-year-old, as a year 6 student. Having never been to any school, going into year 6, imagine how difficult that would be. And often that is the case with a lot of other vulnerable children. They do not know that there is a place or there are centers where they can get education. And when finally someone helped them to get documents and they enter into school, they fall behind because there's just not enough support given to them. I, in fact, have met a few that came to our center that they just got their IC, they went into school as a year 5 student and eventually had to drop out because they were so far behind, the schools could not support the child. And that's it. So now that you have this IC of hope, you know, that you thought, okay, it's gonna bring me opportunities and doors, you enter into school and you realize, oh no, I'm so far behind. And that's why I'm so glad that Yayasan Hasanah supported our learning center, basically to provide quality education to these students that are waiting for the opportunity, and thus having that chance to equip themselves with skills and knowledge that would bring them much further in life and eventually become a very valuable member of society and bringing change to people around them.
Great, thank you, Felicia.
So the project, I guess, or program we worked on was designing on curriculum, so school curriculum. And to take a step back, we understand that in Malaysia, refugees don't live in one camp. They're not all together. We use the term urban refugees, which means they live all over Malaysia, nationwide, amongst Malaysian communities. So that poses its challenges because the community is very fragmented. It's all over. And it's sometimes also very difficult to know where people live. Everyone has different challenges, different struggles, also has different access to resources. And so we recognize that with about 40 to 42,000 children of school-going age all around the country, they need to access school. And then we talk about what kind of schools exist. So you have community schools, you have NGO-run schools, you have big schools, small schools, well-resourced schools, under-resourced schools, and they come in all shapes and sizes. And so something that Refugee is working on is designing sort of a resource bank, if you will, which includes your curriculum, it includes how to run an ALC, so your administration, financially how to run an ALC, lesson plans, professional development for teachers, because a lot of the ALCs struggled with doing that. And so we can turn to the internet and go, oh, it's all on the internet, but actually there's so much on the internet that it's really hard. And if you're already struggling, that's just a wealth of, it's just information overload. And so our relationship with Yayasan Hasanah was to look at designing curriculum, working together. I think importantly, and this is something Dr. Anwar stressed a lot, was working together with other nonprofits. Don't do it alone. Very often in this space, we feel so isolated that we're in our silos and we have to solve our problem and we forget that everyone else is facing similar problems. So working together with like-minded partners to solve the problems that the sector faces. but ultimately improving student education outcomes.
Great, fantastic stuff. Felicia and Deborah both highlighted a lot of the challenges that a lot of refugees and undocumented children face. I want to stress that these challenges are very, very real, right? You have challenges of birth certification, the exam pathways, the everyday lives and everyday struggles of these children. And I think something that Deborah mentioned earlier, I think a word that we can maybe carry forward in this discussion today is the word resilience, right? These children have so much grit, so much resilience, and it is something that we are going to discuss in today's panel as well. How do we find resilience in creative methods? How do we find ways to do things better? What can we do in our own capacities as people who work with refugee and undocumented children directly, or as members of Malaysia today? Before we get into all of that, just a couple of expectation setting. My role is primarily to not give speeches. I am here as, think of myself as the function of the Netflix autoplay button. So my role is very simple. It is just to keep the episodes running and keep you entertained so that you don't frequently scroll Shopee or TikTok during the course of our discussion. So without further ado, I would like to start with Felicia. At ARUS, you have worked closely with undocumented children, many of whom have faced hurdles as basic as getting a birth certificate. Could you maybe help us picture what sort of barriers those look like?
I think just to start with, right, and I learned a lot of this from my students themselves rather than knowing it from other people. So just to paint you a very simple picture, a lot of us, when we think about going to places, often it's so easy for us that we don't really even think about it. Like, what do we use our IC for? Because it becomes so automatic. If you really think about it, IC allows you to do a lot of things that you do it so automatically. Going to your friend's house, if your friend lives in an apartment, if you don't have any form of documentation, you would not be able to get in. Thinking about getting a phone number that we so often use, right, that we don't even think, where did we actually get the phone number from? Normally it's given by your parents. You don't even think like, what do you need? But you know that you need IC or some sort of documentation in order for you to even get a phone number. Shopee that you love to shop on, they all require some sort of documentation that so often we don't think about. And because of that, many of these community members, these students, they will not have access to any of that. And when we think about education for them, those are the things that we have to think about. We cannot tell them about, teach them about financial literacy, save, open a bank account. These are things that are very foreign to them, not because they don't know it exists, but they also know that it's not that easy for them. They cannot buy insurance, they cannot open a bank account. So when we think about educating them, really we have to think about what is meaningful for them. And I think we are very grateful for Hasanah for allowing us to do that. Because the project that Hasanah funded was really, how do we create a meaningful education that speak volumes for the undocumented and stateless children. So what we did was we really look at what would help them. We look at their life trajectory, right? Often we like to see them and sometimes we think like, we're not sure. To be honest, we're not sure where they're going to be. And that is exactly how we need to educate them. We need to help them be problem solvers, people that can actually be very resilient in terms of wherever they go. So the kind of education that we provide them is benchmarked on whatever curriculum is out there. Normally we look at MOE to make sure that we are at a certain standard, but at the same time we then look at, okay, if they're supposed to learn this level of algebra, how does it make sense to them? Even history, right? Because in Malaysia, we learn Malaysia history. How does it make sense for them if eventually they go somewhere else? Even for refugee, right? When they go back to their home country, how do we make sure that whatever they learn here is something that they don't feel like, okay, only applies to Malaysia. When I go back, I have to start all over again. So actually, the skills are very important. When you learn history, the point is, yeah, the knowledge is one thing, the content, but more important is what the skill that you get from learning history. So the skill of summarizing, the skill of going through information and then understanding timeline of events. Those are the skills that you're supposed to get from history, more so than the knowledge, because you can Google when is Malaysia's independence. But the meaning behind that, why do we learn the independence? What actually is that? Those skills are very important to teach the students. And often these are not given to these students. So these are the challenges. And even just talking about, if I go back to the question, right, so sorry, I'm a teacher, so I can go on and on about many things, especially if I talk about my student. But going back to the challenges, I think just having access to it is definitely the core of it. So when I met a few of these students, so we did a TED Talk with them, right? So I sat down with one of the girls, and I still remember when we were thinking about what is passionate to her, what story she wanted to tell. She was telling me about her journey to getting into a school. She was 7, she was very excited, she was with her mother. They walk from one school to another. And at the end of it, they could not get into any school. Now the fact is, if you talk to some of the government officials, you read online, there are ways to get into our national school. However, the reality on the ground, it is still very challenging for you to actually get into school. There is Sekolah Buku Bimbingan Cadangan Kasih created by the government to help stateless children. However, even that school is not that easy to get in. And that school that has so much government support, even they have difficulty to really help their kids get documents. I talked to the principal once, just quite recently in fact. We wanted to make sure that we are working together and not against each other. And when I met the principal, he told me that among the 10 years that they've done this, they have immigration officer coming in, making sure that the students are learning. Their success rate of helping kids to get IC is only 10. 10 students that will manage, or 10 plus that manage to get IC. But education is still very important, because if we do not educate them, what happens to then all these kids that are just everywhere? Especially if you go to childcare, you just see so many of them. We started with about 30 students, and naturally, without any marketing, we went up to 50 the next year, and then 80, and now we have 100 over students. And I think that's the basic challenge, right? That actually even just access to education, access to so many things that we get for granted, is just not available to them. And at the core of it, while healthcare, they lack access, but once you're educated, you're able to then help yourself be more prevented by disease. You're more educated to know how to make sure that you can take care of yourself. You're more educated to then know what are the steps that you can take. Right now, one of my 17 years old, and they can take SPM, by the way, so we register them as independent candidate, because they are educated right now. She is now on one of the panel, a child panel with UNICEF, advocating for herself. And I think that's the level we want to get to, right? Whereby they themselves can start speaking for themselves, and they can be the voice that never got heard. A lot of them, when, even as simple as I still remember, we were having lunch, and I just asked them, what part of the chicken you want? And they were so stunned that I asked them. Normally people would just give them. So as basic as that, right, those are the things that they face, and that is the kind of education that we want to allow them to have a voice, allow them to see what's going on around the world, and an education that allows them to partake in solving all these problems, so that they can see that they too can make a difference in this world that they live in, and they're not there because people don't want them to be there, because often that's how they feel.
Thank you so much, Felicia. Very real and very lived experiences that Felicia has demonstrated and illustrated to us. Now, I want to go to Deborah and ask you about some of the work that you've done with refugee schools. So you've spent many years building and working directly with refugee children. Could you share some of the challenges refugee children face here in Malaysia, and maybe just talk a wee bit more about their journeys here and what they fled and the lack of schooling and healthcare?
Thank you. I mean, just listening to what you were saying, Felicia, it's mad to think that there are individuals today in this world who have no documentation. In an ever-increasing digitized world where everything is online and we're making life easier for people, mobility, movement, access, connectivity, and you have somebody who can't even get a SIM card because they don't have ID. It's, yeah, just when you think about it, how alarming that is. So I guess before I jump into the challenges that a refugee child may face in Malaysia, I think it's important to look at the global context. When we look around the world today, we see it's this growing anti-immigration sentiment, protests popping up everywhere, a lot of xenophobia. Understanding Malaysia is a country in Southeast Asia, and then in this global context of the reality that we have to deal with, that we can't ignore. But also to mention that who are refugees? Where do refugees come from? Often refugees are talked about like they are the problem, they are the issue, but they're not. They're a consequence. People become refugees as a consequence of war, of conflict, of persecution. And so, not that this is something that I don't know, I don't have hope that we're going to solve it tomorrow, but it's a lot of it's governments, it's countries, it's a lot of that then cause refugees. And then other places like countries like Malaysia have to then host refugee populations and figure out how are we going to manage this, right? And I think that's where, for me, when we talk about challenges, I think a lot of the solutions are on the table. We're sending people to space. We're doing incredible feats that technology has enabled us to do. Why is this so difficult, right? And so I come back to this idea of will. There's all the answers are there, the resources are there. What's missing? What's lacking? Some element of will. And so talking about Malaysia, the refugee population here is 200,000 or so. Compare that to the migrant workers who come here in the millions. And so when we talk about how we can actually open doors for refugees, allow them to be part of community, to be contributing members of society, of the economy, we are actually talking about a relatively small number. So we must be very mindful to not allow the fear-mongering and all of that to be able to make us think, oh my God, it's a big, huge numbers here that are trying to take over our country. I think that's such an important message that we have to fight. And more so than that, in Southeast Asia, the vast majority, and Alia has those exact numbers, but the vast majority of refugees come from Myanmar. And so I would even go as far as to say that we have a regional challenge, that we home majority refugees from Myanmar. That means we can actually look at a regional solution to solving this, more so than a global refugee problem. And so the reason I bring these bigger factors up is I remember this one line that World Vision, this international humanitarian organization, uses. They say, in order to help a child, you have to help a family. And in order to help a family, you have to help a community. And so the needs of a child are not isolated. They're part of the family's needs and they're part of the wider community's needs. If you really want to solve a child's problems, it often has to be, you've got to look at the other problems that the family and the community face. So then coming back to Malaysia, talking about refugees here, I think one challenge is the narrative, the media narrative that is played out, a lot of misinformation and a lot of intentional misinformation sometimes that confuses a lot of people about who a refugee is and what they actually, why they are actually in our country. That's a huge challenge. The other one is policy and access. There are so many different stakeholders here that want to actually work with refugees to allow them to work, give them jobs, give them access to school. But the system right now is not set up to allow refugees to access it. And so they're also left out from that part. Then the third is healthcare and education, right? And so this is where I think coming back to the work that we do, we recognize that there's risk. Every day a child wakes up and leaves their house, there is a risk. There's a risk of potential detention. There's a risk that they may not make it to school. The family have to earn money to pay for the kids' education. And so my position is that this situation is just not sustainable. It's untenable. How do all of us here today, right? We have refugees in this room, non-profits, international organizations, Yayasan Hasanah. How do we really support an entire sector when it is fully dependent on charity, on handouts, when adults can't work, when children can't access, when you're not allowed to contribute to your own life, to your own sustainability. How do we support that? And so I think we cannot really talk about this if we're not addressing core policy, core changes that allow people to work, that allow people to really access quality education. Because surviving on charity, it's exhausting all of us. We've been in this, I've been here for 16 years and colleagues for so many years. Do we sit here in 5 years' time and still have the same conversations? I'm like, please no. So really, the solutions really need to be long-term and sustainable. To give a story on, perhaps talk about resilience and grit and how hard individuals, young people have to work to get an education. If I give an example, so we run a scholarship program, a university scholarship program, and we give out full scholarships to deserving refugee youth. It's to some degree merit-based. They have to apply, and this year I think we had just over 100 applications of refugees, right? So that says, wow, there are young refugees out there that want to go to tertiary, they want to go to university, they have goals, aspirations in life, but how hard they have to fight for it. So not only to find a university, because it is quite hush-hush, find a university that may accept them and give them a place, who's going to pay for it, but they can't work, but they have to try to raise funds. They apply to us, but then they don't have, we give them a scholarship, but now they have no money to pay rent, or to put food on the table, or to pay their transport, to work really hard to have hope, which is something that we don't value enough, that if you don't have hope for the future, if you can't imagine what a future looks like, why am I going to wake up every morning and study so hard? No point now. I might as well just quit and hang out, right? So everything that it takes for this one young person to hunt for a university who's going to say, yes, I will accept you, but you got to pay me 10,000 ringgit, right? And the constant challenge and one after the other, and then to have the motivation to study and do well and to pass your exams and to graduate 3 years later, only then to graduate and say, oh, sorry, but you can't work. You know what I mean? So it's everyday kind of struggles that an individual faces that I think is just something that it's incredible. And so just to talk about that, once again, to use the word grit that these kids have to fight for something so basic, I think is incredible. And so my position is then how do we really support these young people be able to, we said education is a great equalizer, just have that parity with the rest of the country, right?
Right. Thank you so much, Deborah. And I think that those are important questions, and I'm mindful that I want to touch on them later on as we progress with our discussion. But before we move forward, maybe we can hear a bit from Alia. And Alia's perspective is really important, and I'd like to zoom out a bit and get your perspective on things. So Alia, how does Malaysia's policy on education for refugee and undocumented children compare with other countries? Are there success stories?
Right, thank you. So I think before I move on to the question, I think it's quite important that we actually step back a little bit in terms of, I'm not sure whether you're confused or you need more information in terms of the definition of refugees as well as undocumented children. Because for refugees, they don't have actually a pathway to get any kind of legal documentation from the Malaysian government right now. So it's different from what, I think you heard Felicia saying that some of her students actually managed to get an IC, and that is actually not applicable for refugees. Because for undocumented children, they are mostly actually Malaysians, but they just don't have any kind of documentation that can actually prove that they are actually Malaysians. So this is not the same for refugees, because refugees, they are the ones that flee countries, and the only documentation that they can get right now in Malaysia is actually UNHCR documentation. So just to make that clear, because I don't want anyone else to go back and say, hey, refugees can get an IC. No, not at all. So in terms of the current policy that Malaysia has right now, maybe I wanted to actually go back to 30 years or 40 years, because I really wanted to share with you that actually Malaysia has a long tradition of providing refuge to refugees. I don't know, I mean, if you are of my age, during the 1990s, in school, we had Bosnian refugees studying alongside with us in national schools. I was in national school, and I remember we had Bosnian refugees that was brought in by our Prime Minister back then to actually, he basically bring about, I think, 300 refugees from Bosnia to actually seek refuge in the country, and their parents actually have access to universities, to work, and their children actually have access to school. Yes, provided that, okay, so I remember they were situated like in a container. It's a separate container. We were actually in classroom, whereby the refugees were actually in a container. They have separate classrooms, separate teachers, separate schedules, but then during breaks we actually interact with each other. And I really remember that because, I still remember some of the Bosnian kids were a bit nakal actually. But anyways, that was before Education Regulation 1998 was introduced. So if we were to recall back in the 1990s, refugees actually, and also undocumented and stateless children actually have access to education, to actually enroll in national schools. It was only the introduction of Education Regulation 1998 that refugees, stateless and undocumented children actually started losing access. And that was because in the Education Regulation, it actually specified 5 categories of children who can actually be admitted to national schools. So that's why I think maybe you have some friends who are probably my age that actually went to national schools because they did. They were able to actually access national school. I had so many Rohingya peers that actually they were very fluent, and they are very fluent in Malay. They can assimilate very well. That was because they actually went to national school. So after that, actually, so fast forward to now, of course, things have changed. So right now, in terms of access for undocumented and refugee children, I'm sure you're familiar with zero reject policy that the two previous Minister of Education, Mazli Malik, introduced back in 2018. So basically this zero reject policy, what comes with it, apart from enhancing the enrollment of children with disability, also to allow registration of undocumented children with at least either one of their parents holding a Malaysian IC into national schools, even when the child lacks documentation. So, so that is actually for undocumented children. So they do have access to national schools, provided that either one of their parents actually have Malaysian IC. But as Felicia was saying, there's a lot of barrier in terms of actually having those children enroll in national schools right now, in terms of providing documentation and whatnot. So the other one that I think Felicia also mentioned, the other initiative that the government has been doing, I think for the past 10 years, was actually the introduction of SBJK school, which is a very specific type of school, the Sekolah Bimbingan Jalinan Kasih. This is actually catering for undocumented children, again, with either or of their parent actually have Malaysian IC, to be able to actually enroll in SBJK school, as well as street children, especially in the childcare area, to actually enroll in this special type of school. SBJK now, I think last year they expanded 2 more SBJKs in Sabah, and I believe they are going to also expand another one in Pahang next year, if I'm not mistaken. So apart from that, specifically for refugees, as you know, there's a lot of alternative learning centers out there, community learning centers out there. In our record from the UNHCR record, we actually know that there are about 179 refugee learning centers situated all across Malaysia right now. And so these are basically informal education. It's alternative learning centers that actually managed by NGOs, by refugee individuals, by community groups, even by Malaysian individuals as well, to actually provide some sort of education to refugees in Malaysia. So going back to the numbers, in terms of refugee children, there's only about 40,000 refugee of school-going age, meaning to say, well, we count from 4 years old until 17 years old. Of course, when you talk about children below 18, there's much more than 40,000 right now registered with UNHCR. So for those learning centers, they do have a pathway to actually register with the government as alternative learning center. So this is as category as Pusat Bimbingan Alternative. There is a special category under the alternative learning center registration policy that learning centers, qualified learning centers, can actually register with Ministry of Education. But of course, there's a lot of challenges and barriers to actually get the license. Just to let you know, of the 179 refugee learning centers out there, only 2 managed to actually register with the Ministry of Education, because the requirement is actually very, very, very stringent. It's almost as close to international school requirement actually. So anyways, I hope I answered your question. Oh no, actually, in terms of comparison between what we have here in Malaysia, as well as globally what other countries have been doing. Okay, this is actually, I've been thinking about this question a lot. Actually, it's very hard to compare because our situation is unique. I know it's very easy to actually say that, right? But looking at Malaysia as an urban or peri-urban, semi-urban refugee situation, because we don't have any camps. There's no camps. There's no refugee camps in Malaysia. And we are also non-ratifying country, meaning to say that Malaysia government doesn't even recognize the 1951 Refugee Convention. There's no MOU between the government as well as UNHCR. Malaysia government also put in a reservation in the CRC, the Child Rights Convention, on Articles 7 as well as, I don't remember the other one, I think 28(1)(a), which basically limited the access for education for non-Malaysian children. And so when comparing with other countries such as Turkey, they are a signatory country and they host about 3.1 million refugees. If we were to compare with Lebanon, they also host about 1.2 million refugees. They are non-signatory country. I think Lebanon is the closest that we can compare with. Refugees are not, 80% of their refugees are not in camps. So they are actually situated in urban, they are living among other Lebanese. And so with Lebanon, what they did was that they allow access to the national schools for refugees. But what they do is they do a double shift system, whereby in the morning, this is just an example, in the morning it will be the national students who actually go to the school, and then in the afternoon they will cater for refugees. So there's that introduction of double shift system. The other one that I wanted to highlight is probably Thailand, our neighbor. They are also non-signatory country for Refugee Convention, and they have camp setting, which is actually located mostly at the border between Thailand and Myanmar. But they also have a small number, about 4,000 refugees who are actually located in urban setting. And so they do have a policy that was approved by the cabinet that allow all non-citizen children, including refugees, to actually enroll in national school. But right now, if I'm not mistaken, they are limited to only the BMA school, which is the Bangkok Metropolitan Authority schools. So only in certain schools that they actually allow non-citizen children to actually enroll in the national school. But what's interesting is that they also have a funding mechanism to support this to support paying for the seats that are occupied by non-Thai students. So this is what they call EEF, Equitable Education Funding. So this funding is actually, how it works is that they actually get private companies to actually fund this pool fund, and of course private companies will get tax incentive, and then they will use this fund to actually cover for expenses that are related to inclusive education, which also to support non-citizen children in Thailand to actually enroll in certain schools. So I think we can definitely adopt some of this model. There's a lot of potential. There's already system being built by government of Malaysia. We don't need to change the law. We don't need to change the Education Act. All it's needed is just to close the gap a little bit in terms of the administrative gap, I think. All that is needed is actually a circular or administrative instruction from the minister or from MOE itself to actually enable some sort of access. I mean, we can start small and then we can go big later.
Great. Thank you so much, Alia. Fantastic stuff. I think the thing that caught my attention the most was the fact that out of the 179 refugee schools, there's only 2 that gets accepted. Meaning to say there's like a 1.16% chance of you getting accepted, which is, to put that quite plainly, it's easier to get into Harvard than it is to get accepted as a school.
Sorry, if I could just quickly add, right?
Please.
Because I was in an MOE meeting and they talk about that. They talk about registration for Alternative Learning Center. And when even in that meeting, there were a few MOE departments, even among themselves, one department said, they recognize ALCs, you can register, and then the other department that actually does the registration stepped in and said, oh, hold on, there is criteria. Not every ALC is recognized. And it's true, so far there is only 2. And from what they were sharing, it is ALC that educate a certain community. That was one of the criteria that the officer mentioned. And that's why it's so limited as well. So I think these are things that, even for us, right, if the ministry themselves is so unclear who can, what more us, right, that is trying to do education, but at the same time, we ourselves want to be recognized, not for the sake of it, but to also make sure that there is governance around it, which I think that's very important as well.
Great. I think, Felicia, when you were talking, I think the thing that came to my mind was, this feels like almost, navigating the system feels like almost like doing a really, really complex Rubik's Cube that nobody has, has the answer to. There's no YouTube video on telling you how to solve a Rubik's Cube in 5 minutes. We're looking for that YouTube video with this issue here. So to everybody who's listening, who's here in attendance, I just want to very quickly direct you to the screen that we have here. If you have questions thus far, and addressed to all our panelists, specific panelists, please direct them to the Slido that we have displayed. Of course, if by now you have opinions and feedback, we are eager to hear them as well. So please do share them on the QR code. So, a couple of questions from my end. I think for our panelists here, focusing really on the teaching and learning of these students, from your experiences, what stands out about teaching and learning in refugee and undocumented children's learning centers? And what sort of challenges do you face on the ground as you conduct your lessons, as you conduct your classes? Deborah, you mentioned about curriculum and resource building. What sort of challenges exist? Maybe we can start with you.
So in fact, we just holding this report here. We had a needs assessment done at 30 ALCs across Peninsular Malaysia, and then interviews with another, I think it was 10 or 20 organizations that work with refugees to understand what are the gaps and what are the needs of refugees. So it's actually quite timely to talk about this. And many of the challenges are sort of, we already know, obvious, but something that was a massive standout that I want to highlight is the incredible, to use the word again, resilience of these people running the ALCs to keep them open, to figure out ways to raise funds, to keep kids coming into class. And you go visit some of these schools, and I'm sure many of you have, and you see some of the situations are like just not, I mean, it shouldn't even be a school, do you know? It's just not, the standards are just not there. It's protection, child protection, so many things are there, but they go above and beyond to keep their school running. And despite everything, even sometimes the teachers take home 200 ringgit a month, 300 ringgit a month. So that was something that was just incredible to see. Wow, imagine what would happen if they were just supported a little bit more. But some of the key findings we had were structural and policy barriers. So having UNHCR recognition or protection made them feel more safe, that authorities wouldn't come to know that UNHCR recognizes their schools. That some of them, like for example, Refugee School, we're a registered non-profit in Malaysia. I'm Malaysian, so there's that additional protection. Whereas some community schools are run by the local refugee community. It's not registered. If someone turns up at their door, who do they call? What help? Who do they reach out to for help? So I think that was one big sense, a sense of safety and security. The second was organizational challenges. So how do I do my finance? How do I make sure my books are kept good if I need to fundraise? How do I set up an ALC? What are the administrative things I need to think about? UNHCR will ask for student data. Oh my gosh, how do I do student data? So a lot of the administrative things that, to Felicia's point, help you adhere to governance standards and to run a good entity, right? The third was students. Of course, being able to, they can't pay, they don't have the money, so how do they pay school fees? They live too far away from the school, they can't access the school. So a lot of very daily operational challenges for the students to access the school. And then teachers, quality of teachers. You have really passionate, committed individuals, but they aren't qualified teachers, they don't have the resources available to them, they don't have the support, the training. So we talked about this thing earlier of basic education versus quality education, right? And the school's running, but it's how much value is it actually giving the child? And then lastly is curricula, the quality of the curriculum. If I don't have qualified teachers, who's going to create a lesson plan? Who's going to prepare the kid for the exam? And that whole pathway, right? Which is why you end up with a lot of kids that drop out, they need to work for the family, they don't pass the exams. And of course, overall, you're not seeing this rainbow. So if you imagine the rainbow of hope, the student at the beginning of the rainbow is not seeing the hope. They don't feel supported. There's no money to support them. Why do I want to go to university? Who's going to pay for it? I need to get a job. My mom said I need to work. So that rainbow of hope has so many holes and gaps in it. So I think that would be, some of the just in terms of categorizing the sort of challenges that a lot of ALCs face. And once again, because it's so siloed, so fragmented, no one knows who to reach out to. And so something we're trying to do now is consolidate that. So some of the solutions or recommendations that came out were sort of a refugee council, a Malaysian Education Refugee Council. It could exist in some forms here and there, some forms, but a proper refugee education council has membership, and then it becomes a focal point when we talk to the government and other stakeholders. So we're actually looking at all sectoral needs of refugee children and youth in education. That was a big recommendation. Of course, professional development for teachers, creating a resource bank, are also some great ways of supporting the sector. And ideally, it comes down to policy and legal frameworks, right? If that can be made more friendly for the refugee context, that would be great. And I also make this very valid point that, everyone running refugee schools, they're doing the work that our government then is not having to do. We're fundraising, we're raising resources, millions of dollars every year, keeping these kids in a class. What is the alternative to that? Does anyone want to see kids on the street? No. We know there's going to be a lot of consequences to that, right? So the work that the private sector is doing, firstly, the economic value of the work in the millions, but the social value of the work, keeping these children in classrooms, in education, actually needs to be really wholly recognized by our government authorities and stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Felicia.
So I think I'll speak more on the ground, sort of like teaching and learning, right? You see two spectrum of students. You see one that are so eager to actually prove themselves. Because once you give them the opportunity to learn, to educate, to get education, they are so eager to show that they can actually do it. So you have that spectrum of students that really want to do well, really want to do go places, and the moment you talk to them, they then dare to sort of dream a little bit, but be realistic as well. So they are very open. So with our students, we have a lot of conversation with them. We are very honest with them. We don't tell them that, okay, dream and be a doctor, but we say, okay, if you want to be a doctor, the reality is that it will be difficult. It is not impossible. Nothing is ever impossible, but you really have to work extra hard for it, right? Because opportunities are scarce for you. Now, there is also the other side of the spectrum where, like Deborah mentioned, right, these kids who never really saw a future for themselves, and understanding that most of my kids are stateless or undocumented. How did that come about? A lot of times is family problems that they face. So they are coming from very vulnerable families. So we do have a lot of students that have a lot of adverse childhood experiences, and so we work very closely with ThriveWell that provide mental health support, because these students, while as much as they want to succeed, as much as they are so grateful for all this opportunity, they also come from background that has a lot of challenges. They are only in this situation because of all these things that has happened in their family. And so we also have to provide education that can support these children that actually has so much potential. It's just that they come from such traumatic background. And so we focus a lot on doing social emotional learning, which is also something that Yayasan Hasanah has been supporting, not just for ALC, but for nationwide as well. Because we see all around Malaysia now, there's so many bullying cases, there's so many traumatic cases that happen. And SEL essentially is that tool that really will help the student be resilient, know how to form good relationship, and know how to have a good social interaction. So when it comes to educating this community, one side of it, you want to ensure that the students that want it, you provide them with the education that allows them to really explore. So we do project-based learning whereby, we get students to think about what's happening in childcare. If you don't know, if you're very much into bundles, second-hand kind of fashion, which is more sustainable, childcare is actually famous for it. And I learned it from my student because they'll talk about bundle and bundle and bundle. So one of the class that we did, a whole 3 months around it, was on sustainable fashion. So they went into sustainable fashion. They said, okay, teacher, come, let's go. They bring me, and they said, our school trip is gonna be at 12 midnight. And I said, oh, hold on. I don't know if I can tell your parents that we're gonna go on a school trip at 12 midnight. And so I said, I think 10 p.m. Okay, at least we end by midnight, and I'll have a conversation with your parents to make sure that they're okay. But all of them were like, teacher, if we go at 10, nothing will be open. So I said, it's okay, we'll just go talk to whichever vendors that's open. But honestly, true enough, by the time we left, many were just setting up. But we were still able to talk to many of the vendors. This was the first time they actually found out where the clothing were coming from. Because they were just consumer before this, and many of us are just consumer. We rarely think about, even if it's second-hand, right, where does it actually come from? Does it come from an ethical place? Or is it just sort of like clothes that's down onto the street and you resell it? So that was a very interesting project that they then not just talked to the vendors, they went online, they did research, they went into child labor. So they created an art exhibition actually. So we were thinking, okay, how do we tell people that environment is very important without just talking about it? So they use art. They use art to tell a story. These older girls of mine, they created this very amazing artwork that is made out of a sewing machine, and there were like missing letters here and there to talk about child labor and the lack of education access for these child labor, and so much story behind the art that we do, that they do, and that is the kind of education that they want. They want to be able to explore and go beyond what is out there. And then you have this other group of students where so much support is needed. So we focus a lot on providing social emotional learning for them. And we see tremendous effect on the younger ones especially. So from students that could not regulate themselves, becoming peers for their friends. So you would see a kid throwing tantrum and you see another kid going, breeding, can we do breeding together? And then if it doesn't work, then the kid, because we did this calm corner, the kid would then grab slime, because that's something they love. They say, okay, please slime, please slime. And then if it still doesn't work, they know to like, okay, you go sit there, calm corner. You know, so these are the things that kind of education that we not just have to provide for these students because they really need it, but essentially, what I'm trying to say is also, this is a good learning ground for all of us as well, because these are the most vulnerable children, and if we figure out how to educate them, we can use the same model to any child around Malaysia as well that is equally marginalized, and we can use those models to really support children anywhere around Malaysia.
Great, thank you. Alia.
Okay, so I don't teach refugee children, but I do have teaching experience, but in a different context. I taught in Mata Pinta for gifted and talented students, so that requires a whole set of skills. But I wanted to just share with you my first interaction with a refugee child. I remember when I started working with UNHCR in 2012, I went to this NGO school in Lembah Keramat, Perkim School. They actually focus more on Rohingya children. And I remember looking at this one child. It was like this child has a very, very, her eyes is just so wonderful. It's just like, I didn't realize through that interaction, it was the first time that I didn't realize, never in my mind, that Rohingya children actually has a very nice eyes. Very like blue, grey colored. And that actually made me think, why is it there's this stereotype around Rohingya? A lot of people were actually saying that, there's a lot of negative things that being mentioned about Rohingyas in general. But this actually made me also relate to my own experience with the Bosnian children, with the Bosnian students who were in national schools back in 1990s. And so what I could relate is basically, these children, they have been deprived of education for many, many, many generations. Back in their own country, where they flee, they didn't have access to education. And of course, there's lack of knowledge in general in terms of what rights do they have, how to actually defend themselves. And of course, their first defense mechanism is actually to protect themselves, to just make sure that they keep whatever they have, and that may look selfish to other people, and they, just try to really protect themselves in a way that may be seen as rude to other people. And this is where I always think education is actually very, very important, because that can actually change their attitude and behavior and how they could actually assimilate with other children, because children are children first. Adults are the ones who actually shape them. And so, so bringing back to my role now as someone working with UNHCR, of course, when we look at interventions in terms of teaching and learning, we look at system thinking, we look at systems in general. So not only looking at the capacity of teachers, but also how well the system has an enabling environment for children to actually thrive and survive. And also looking at community, how community could actually play a role in education. And these are the three basic things, basically: enabling environment, capacity of schools, and the third one is really the role of community. And so when it comes to teaching and learning, of course, the way we try to actually improve the quality of learning centers, for example, is really through teacher training. I am a big believer in building capacity of teachers. Teachers has a huge role to play. If we were to actually compare with Finland, if you put any kind of children, I wouldn't say kind, if you put different abilities of children in one classroom, that particular teacher will be able to actually address different needs, because their already been capacitated in terms of how to actually address certain issues or problems or challenges. And so for UNHCR, of course, one of the things that we try to do is actually through teacher training. Last year we focused a bit more, we had a collaboration with Veritas University where we provide teacher training for 150 teachers teaching at learning centers. So last year is more of general, classroom management. But this year we have a follow-up training where we actually try to embed social-emotional learning, looking at, trauma-based education, child-centered trauma-based education, so that teachers will be able to actually address certain problems or challenges that they see in the classroom.
Great, thank you, Alia. So I want to be mindful that this space is definitely for all of you listening here. And so I'm going to very quickly jump into Q&A. So we have a very interesting question. Also for everyone who's using Slido, please, if there are questions that you feel very passionate about, that you have you're interested to find out the answers to, please hit that like so that I know that, this is something that the majority of you want to know about. So one of the questions that has a few likes is, are there existing efforts to organize and pool resources or assets between alternative learning centers? And is this an area of potential? Deborah, maybe.
So yes, there are efforts. In terms of education, I do think there were quite a few organizations. I think that the work Felicia's doing, YCK, Refugee, Ideas International, El Shaddai. There's a few entities that I can think of that are actually trying to work together more to share resources and look at consolidating curriculum. But I think it's still happening like one-on-one or a couple of NGOs here and there, but it's not so much nationwide, if you will. So I do think there is. I think at this point everyone is quite aligned in what a good solution could look like for curriculum. So probably in the next few years, hopefully we'll see a little bit more. It'll be more developed, and then we'll be able to see deployment of those from an education perspective. In terms of resources of fundraising, no, I don't think that's very much everyone you speak to will have a very different set of challenges. It depends on how many partnerships you're able to build. Even grant writing, right? To even apply for a Yayasan Hasanah grant, anyone would know that it is quite a process. and your reporting and impact, and so it's not for the faint-hearted. Let's just put it that way. You've got to be registered, fairly established. So if you're talking about a community-run ALC, they can't even begin that conversation, right? So that's where you can look at what kind of sector support would be, and I think UNHCR also in talks with various global organizations for that. But I think that is, I think, a big point of what we're trying to make here today is that even though refugees live amongst us, they are still very isolated and siloed because they're denied existing in our ecosystem. And so when you do that, so many other problems come about. But I definitely think the mindset from us on the ground right now is collaboration and don't reinvent the wheel. Be smart with how you use and deploy your resources.
Great, thank you.
I think just to quickly add, right, I think what Deborah was saying, we are definitely aligned. I think the execution is a little bit slow, only because also we are all very resource, like capacity sort of tight, because there are not that many staff, we can afford to have such a big team. So for example, like me, I'm teaching, I'm doing the leading and everything. So while it's nice to have someone that can then organize all this effort, but at the same time recognizing that manpower is also very limited. So I think the desire is there. I think there are efforts that we have talked together before, and part of our grant was also to unite the ALC together. So conversation has started, but it's a little bit hard to really sustain it and then have something concrete. But definitely it's something that I personally am very looking forward to and want to do more in the next few years as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's getting a bit of traction, and it's to do with us talking a bit more about the registration, or rather the influence that MOE has for ALCs, thank you, sorry. So somebody has a question here that says, what's an added benefit for refugee schools to be registered with MOE?
Good question.
This one is protection from the government. UNHCR will never be able to give the kind of protection that the government could give. Right now, a lot of the learning centers, they are not registered with the municipal council, the city council, or even let alone with the Ministry of Education. I mean, there's a lot of registration needed to be done actually in order to be considered as licensed. And they are subjected to visits, monitoring visits from different authorities, from BOMBA, from City Council, from police, special branch. You can ask, I see few of the learning centers owners here, you can ask how many times do you get these kinds of visits. So from my knowledge, from these 2 learning centers that registered with the government, they had 0 visits ever since they registered with the government. Because the authorities know that they're registered and they are under the purview of the State Education Department monitoring. They're in constant communication with State Education Department. I think it's that protection in a sense that comes from the state.
But I think to add, it's also understanding the reality on the ground. I mean, if, like we said earlier, if the requirements are up in the sky, no one's going to do it. So you don't expect the numbers to be more than 2, 3, 4. And I could speak even from Fuji's perspective. It's we tried, attempted, and then it kind of never went anywhere. So we've not pursued it beyond that because we also weigh the effort, the cost, the requirements, whether we can fulfill it and that. But I think that the serious conversation here is if the Ministry of Education or the government, as it were, want to tackle this, then I think they need to address it. They have to understand the needs of the community, the reality of the community, and if you don't want to further leave people out and leave people behind, you've got to design the solution with them in mind, right? And not the other way, which I think now is, here's a requirement, here's a framework. If you want, you have to fulfill this. And so there's a huge gap between the refugees, us on the ground, and then where we need to get to.
I think in addition to that as well, I think I want to emphasize that a lot of these learning center, they want to sort of operate legally as well. Nobody wants to be seen as illegal, right? Because that is already the perception of a lot of this community. And so having that status allow us to even change that narrative a bit, because that is one of the challenges that the community face, that stigma, that prejudice. That so when you have that recognition, it does help. It does help with the whole thing, the whole challenge about not being recognized. And I think just quickly onto the problem of like why is it so difficult. So when I went on a meeting with MOE, EPRD, they mentioned that it's also multiple departments. So it's not just a problem of the Ministry of Education, because these are people of different nationalities or even without nationality. It then requires other ministry as well, which then becomes difficult. I think that is one of the challenges, that it is like what you say, it's not impossible, but it's that will, right? Will you want to have that conversation where multiple ministry have to then work together and agree on like, okay, this is how we get the registration done. I think that is one of the challenges of it.
Very interesting, Felicia, that you mentioned. I think the association with the legalization of these things, right, is generally just a safeguard. And I think that segues into another question. Sorry, I'll put you on the spot quite a bit. This question talks about safeguarding, and in particular it talks about the kind of protection that UNHCR provides to new ALCs or those that already exist. Do you mind just giving us a brief?
Okay, all right. So protection is a really big word actually, if we want to dissect it a little bit. So in terms of UNHCR, we are not a licensing body. We don't have any kind of authority to give licenses to learning centers or even to really tell off the government, no, you cannot visit this school because this is, I mean, it's Malaysia. Malaysia has its own laws. And so learning centers have to follow certain laws. Of course, I mean, from UNHCR side, our role is more of to actually advocate to the government to ensure that there some sort of safeguarding available out there and to actually, guide the government in terms of how to actually provide that safeguarding mechanism to learning centers in general. So we've had many conversations with Ministry of Education, with the National Security Council especially. They are our counterpart. The National Security Council is actually our main counterpart, as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They are in a working group with us in terms of what we call capacity sharing, capacity building of a government to set up a national framework on management of refugees in Malaysia. And so through that conversations, through that understanding is how we actually try to advocate to the government, this is the lived realities of the refugees. Please consider this, please consider that. Of course, in the past, we've been given, letters to learning centers to kind of recognize, to basically provide some sort of, evidence that they are somewhat related to UNHCR. But of course, that is not really, I would say, it's a tool that's actually not recognized by the Malaysian government. So we have that problem again. I mean, UNHCR is not a licensing body. So of course, when it comes to international protection, whenever there's actually a need for UNHCR to intervene, for example, immigration come to a learning center and take children in the learning center because they don't have valid visa to actually stay in the country, yes, UNHCR will intervene there and then. That is actually our mandate. We'll be able to actually do that under the international protection framework. But again, there's very limited capacity in terms of UNHCR role to actually safeguard learning centers. I mean, I've been telling learning centers the reality is that this is Malaysia. They have to follow the Malaysian law. Of course, when it comes to detention and arrest, we will be able to step in because of our mandate and role. But again, I mean, we have a very limited role in terms of making sure that learning centers could actually survive without license. And so a lot of our work is actually based on advocacy. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alia. And I'm mindful of time, so I want to just very quickly bring up one really hot question, and maybe just summarize a bit later on. So this question, feel free, anyone really. Is there truth to some thinking that Malaysian kids will lose out if we direct our resources to refugee or stateless kids instead of B40? Is this a zero-sum game?
I think very quickly, because Deborah mentioned this, right, about the whole economic gain. You have all these people that are actually so willing to actually contribute to honestly anywhere, because they're in a situation they're not given any opportunity, and essentially it is more a gain to educate them than actually not do anything. That's sort of what I think as well.
And I think if you look at, let's not talk from an emotional perspective, just facts and figures. If you could look at countries, I think Alia mentioned earlier, Turkey, you have examples now in Thailand, in Jordan, in Lebanon, and you see how countries they're facing the issue head on and they're coming up with solutions. And you see that people are able to contribute to the economy, and you see the GDP contribution. Ideas Research Body did a study in 2019, I believe, if refugees are allowed to work, what are the upsides, right? And it was all largely very positive. You tackle the social integration issues, you build bridges instead of fear, plus also people are part of the economy. And let's not forget, Malaysia brings in how many million foreigners to do jobs that we can't do or don't want to do, right? Refugees, I think if the working population, employable population of refugees are about 60,000, I think, from what I saw in the report.
Yeah.
So 60,000 people, millions of people. It's very different, right? And I think even what we're advocating, and many of us advocate for, is we're actually saying if you allow the private sector to play its role and they don't feel penalized for supporting and working with refugees, if you can give tax exemption, all these incentives, the private sector will step up and hire refugees, will open their doors to refugee education, will do so much. And even now, our scholarship, we pay for the refugees to go to private universities. So I don't think this is necessarily a conversation about is the government going to have to fork out a lot of money and take it away from Malaysians. I think the sector will solve that, but I think it's just enabling citizens of the country and companies here to work with refugees that actually will tackle that. So it can be very much a win-win. There are so many possibilities. I think it's the will to sit down and, like Ali was saying, a national framework. That is what we need. All of these departments and parties to sit together, design something that can work for all of us. No one is advocating, we're all Malaysians sitting here, no one is advocating like them at the expense of us. No one is saying that, right? And so I think that's where all the different stakeholders really need to be able to share their opinions, and the government should consult all of us when it comes to designing these solutions.
Great, thank you. And so we have a lot of questions here, primarily two, mostly about funding, how we get our funding, what sort of sources of funding can tap into, and also a very favorite question, collaboration. How can we collaborate further? What sort of resources do we need? How can we share? How can we expand? And so I encourage everybody, if you do have those questions, please feel free to reach out to the panelists later on as we eat, as we mingle around. Before we end, just very quickly, some might be wondering, why am I here moderating? And I think just to very quickly talk about AOD and the work that we do at AOD. So AOD, we do a lot of work around programs, advocacy, and a lot of times research as well. And so we have reports that are out. We've done testing. Okay, we have a report that's out by VACE AI, AOD, WAO, Undi 18 that talks a bit about discrimination and how there are many types of discrimination that happens in Malaysia, but particularly that a lot of Malaysians do face discrimination. 64% from our findings say that Malaysians face discrimination. 43% of young Malaysians face, in particular, racial discrimination. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because discrimination comes in many different forms, right? It's not just interracial, it's also to do with different ethnic. Because you're laughing. Sorry.
Probably the battery.
Thank you, great. Oh, okay, much comfortable. Excellent. And so we have these reports, right? And particularly, I think I want to highlight that our report, in particular, our most recent one, Social Cohesion Report, it talks a bit about how many Malaysians, they want to see a future that is harmonious. They want to see a future that works for everybody, but they're really not sure how that looks like. A lot of them, in the VAS AI report, 30% of Malaysians are undecided on whether refugees should be allowed to even work here. And that 30%, that information gap, is really what we want to tap into in today's discussion. We really want to make sure that people who are really on the fence are thinking about how the knowledge that we're sharing here in the space that is provided can help us change mindsets and can help us make a difference. And so the work that we do, I hope, influences a lot of the work that you do as well. So in AOD's perspective, usually we cannot leave children aside. Children are always part of the equation. I work under the programs team, and we do a lot of camps that include Malaysians from all across Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak. We fly them out and we do a lot of camps, and we try our best to to create the social cohesion that is mentioned in the reports. It's not just a feel-good-ism. It's more than that. It's something that isn't as abstract as we think it is. It's something that we have to curate, and it's the programs that we do as panelists that allow us to sort of curate and make Malaysia a safer, a better place. And so before I end, I would like to very quickly ask our panelists, if you had to change one policy or make a policy, just one, very quickly, or rather, yes, let's go with policy in the interest of like keeping it brief. But if you have to change one policy or create a policy, what would that be? And also, for all of us here in the room and those watching at home, what is one thing we can do in our daily lives to make a difference? Yeah.
I would say the right to work. Because if you give refugees the right to work, they're not dependent on handouts and charity. They can earn an income, potentially be taxed. It tackles issues of social integration. They can then pay for their children's education, which then solves our problems because now we can charge higher school fees and we don't have to fundraise as much. So I think the domino effect is there, and I think they then have a sense of dignity, a sense of agency. So that would be my one. And what was your second question? What was it?
Sorry, it slipped past me.
Oh, that was just the one.
Sure.
I think building on to that, I think is then right to education, but not just basic education. I think even tertiary education, like what Deborah mentioned, right? Sometimes even for refugee, it's very grey area, which university will even accept you. I think just having access to all these things would bring very much a domino effect to a lot of these communities' life.
Okay. I would say short term. Expand the Sekolah Bimbingan Jalinan Kasih to allow undocumented and refugee children to enroll. Long term, for Ministry of Education to include one more category of children in Education Regulation 1998, so that refugees, undocumented and stateless children can actually enroll in national school. So in terms of your second question, now I remember.
Me too.
How all of us could actually do it. I mean, right now, what we can contribute. Actually, I just have one request. Get to know the refugees. I think once you start with an open mind, you see why they are here, and you started to really understand their situation, and then start small, and then I'm sure you'll be able to help them somewhat, whether it's small or big. Yeah.
I would change my first answer from right to work to to a recognized identity card like the UN card that opens up all rights for them. Yes, one can change. And for that question, to do one thing, I would echo Alia, an open mind and an open heart. But not just for refugees, even as a Malaysian, even amongst my fellow Malaysians, we have so much that we don't know about each other, that we don't respect about each other, that we don't, So I would say, try to do something different, Look around, who are your friends, who are your circles, where do you go on holidays? Put yourself out of your comfort zone. Go learn something new, experience something different, just as a Malaysian. And when that changes, and my hope is that us young people, although I think I'm on the border now, age border, but as young Malaysians, if we are the change, then when you guys are in positions of power, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, you'll be making the right decisions. Sometimes it's hard to change the older folk, so I think we can be that change, and I think it's how you live out every single day in your actions and your behavior. And even for the refugees here, it's what are we doing, right? We always say with the refugee, what are we doing to also learn about Malaysian culture, to make a Malaysian friend, to learn something about what this beautiful country has to offer. And I think that open-mindedness is what will help all of us build a better world.
I think just very quickly, echoing what Alia mentioned about conversation, right? Because that was how I learned about a lot of the stateless and undocumented community. I would say about 4 or 5 years ago, I knew nothing much about it, even though I grew up where my kids are right now. I was born in the same hospital as many of them were born in, but I don't know I don't even know how someone can be stateless in that moment. But the moment I started talking to them, even the kids, they could tell me their situation, they can tell me their story, and from there, you really get to know what is needed to be done. You really understand that actually, they are not very different from us. Once you start interacting with them, you'll be surprised that you can't even differentiate them with us. Because essentially, a lot of times, what actually separates us is a lot of just borders that, again, is all human-made, right? So I think that human connection is something that everyone can start. You can start talking to them, can start having more conversation, and through that, there will be a much better understanding as well. And with understanding, something that Malaysians love to say, tak kenal maka tak cinta. So I think that's definitely the first step that we can all take.
Great, thank you very much. And in order to cinta us, please get to talk to us a bit more later on. Ask us about the work that we do, about potential ways to collaborate, and we look forward to bringing this discussion and this dialogue into tangible action in the future. With that, thank you very, very much, Alia, Deborah, Felicia. It has been fantastic moderating you guys and holding this discussion. Thank you so much, everyone.
And that concludes our panel and Q&A session for today. Another round of applause for our speakers and panelists.